My name is Ella Brooks. I'm 34 years old, and I need to tell you about the day I discovered that loving your family unconditionally can sometimes mean loving yourself conditionally, and how that realization nearly destroyed me. For years, I was the daughter who showed up, who fixed things, who quietly absorbed every financial crisis like it was my personal responsibility, and I did it all because I believed that's what family meant. But then, after paying off a $420,000 loan that saved my parents from losing everything, they looked me in the eye, thanked me with tears in their voices, and told me the house would be registered in my sister's name. Not mine, not ours, hers. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is about to take you through every emotion I buried for years, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. You're probably wondering how someone could sacrifice that much money, that much time, that many silent nights of stress and anxiety, only to be erased from the very thing they built. Well, let me take you back to where it all started, to the moment I became the reliable one, the daughter who didn't need attention, who didn't cause problems, who just existed in the background while everyone else lived their lives in full color. This isn't just a story about money or betrayal, though there's plenty of both. This is about the moment I realized that being useful to people doesn't mean you're valued by them, and that sometimes the people who benefit most from your silence are the ones who fear your voice the most. So buckle up, because what I'm about to share will make you question everything you thought you knew about family loyalty, sacrifice, and the difference between being loved and being used. Have you ever been the one everyone depends on but no one truly sees? Let me know in the comments, because I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly what that feels like, and why I finally decided to stop paying the price for other people's peace. They thanked me for paying the loan, then told me the house would be in my sister's name. Those words didn't just land, they detonated, shattering years of carefully constructed denial in a single breath. I remember standing in my parents' living room, the same room where I'd celebrated birthdays and holidays, where I'd signed loan documents with trembling hands 3 years earlier, and feeling my entire body go cold despite the summer heat pouring through the windows. My mother, Patricia, had tears in her eyes when she said it, like her gratitude was supposed to soften the blow, like emotional performance could somehow erase the math of what they were actually doing. My father, Robert, stood behind her with his hand on her shoulder, nodding slowly as if this decision was not only logical but inevitable, as if my sister Madison, who hadn't contributed a single dollar, who hadn't lost sleep over interest rates or payment deadlines, deserved to inherit the security I had purchased with my own financial future. If this story is hitting close to home, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. You're going to want to see how this unfolds, because what I'm about to tell you gets even more twisted. The thing about betrayal is that it doesn't always announce itself with screaming or drama. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in gratitude, dressed up as practicality, delivered by people who genuinely believe they're being fair. I stood there processing their words, my mind racing through every sacrifice I'd made, the vacations I didn't take, the promotions I turned down because I couldn't relocate, the relationships that withered because I was too stressed and exhausted to nurture them. And I realized that none of it had ever been seen as sacrifice by them. To my parents, I was simply doing what responsible daughters do, what I was supposed to do, while Madison was protected, shielded, given permission to be irresponsible because that's just how she is. The phrase echoed in my head as I looked at them. That's just how she is. As if personality was destined, as if being careless absolved you of consequence, as if my competence had somehow obligated me to carry everyone else's weight. That single sentence, "The house will be in Madison's name," collapsed years of silent sacrifice in seconds. And suddenly, I could see the entire architecture of our family dynamic with brutal clarity. I wasn't the responsible daughter. I was the emergency fund, the backup plan, the insurance policy they never had to think about, because I was always there, always saying yes, always absorbing the impact of their choices. My stomach turned as I realized that gratitude without equity is just manipulation with better manners. That acknowledgement without action is simply a way to make the person being used feel guilty for wanting more. They saw my face change, I couldn't hide it, and my mother reached for my hand, saying something about how this was best for everyone, how Madison needed more stability, how they knew I would understand, because that's who you are. And in that moment, I understood something far more devastating than their decision. I understood that they had never intended to treat us equally, that the system had always worked perfectly for them, and that I had been funding my own erasure one payment at a time. I need you to understand something about invisibility. It doesn't happen overnight, and it's rarely intentional in the beginning. I became the invisible daughter slowly, incrementally, through 1,000 small moments where my competence was rewarded with more responsibility and less recognition, where my ability to handle things quietly meant I was left to handle things alone. Growing up, Madison was the one with the big personality, the one who filled rooms with her presence, who made mistakes loudly and was forgiven just as loudly because her chaos somehow seemed more honest, more human, more worthy of attention than my consistency. I was 7 years old the first time I remember hearing my father tell someone, "Ella doesn't need much attention, she's fine on her own." And even then, even as a child, I felt something shift inside me, some understanding that being fine meant being forgotten, not the favorite, not the loud one, just the reliable shadow who learned early that love in our family was distributed based on need. And since I never seemed to need anything, I received maintenance-level affection at best. I excelled in school, not because anyone pushed me, but because achievement was the only language I had for mattering, for making myself visible in a family where visibility seemed reserved for crisis and charm. Madison struggled with math, so she got tutors and patient explanations at the dinner table. I taught myself advanced calculus in my bedroom, because asking for help felt like admitting I wasn't as self-sufficient as everyone believed. When she wrecked her first car at 17, my parents bought her another one within a month and paid for defensive driving courses. When I got into my dream college 2 years later, the celebration lasted through dessert, and the financial aid conversation started immediately after. I learned that competence doesn't inspire investment. It inspires exploitation, that the child who can survive neglect will be left to survive it, while the child who demands attention will receive it endlessly. And shadows don't get their names on deeds. We get thanked in private, acknowledged in moments of guilt, praised for qualities that ultimately serve everyone but ourselves. By the time I was in my 20s, the pattern was set like concrete. Madison called when she needed money, emotional support, or someone to blame for her latest disaster. And I showed up every single time because that's what reliable people do. My parents called when they needed advice about investments, when they needed someone to co-sign a loan, when they needed a voice of reason to convince Madison to make better choices she rarely made, because why would she? When consequences were always absorbed by someone else, I became the family's emotional and financial shock absorber, the one who turned chaos into calm, crisis into solution, and my reward for this service was to be needed constantly but valued conditionally. I didn't realize until much later that I had confused being indispensable with being important, that I had mistaken my function for my worth, and that the role I'd accepted, the invisible, reliable, uncomplaining daughter, was never meant to be temporary. It was meant to be permanent, profitable, and ultimately disposable. It started as temporary help during a family crisis, the kind of emergency that arrives with urgency and leaves with amnesia about who actually solved it. 3 years ago, my father called me on a Tuesday evening. I remember because Tuesdays were my meal prep nights, the one predictable ritual in my otherwise chaotic work schedule, and his voice had that particular tremor that meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. He explained that he and my mother had made some poor investment decisions, trusted the wrong financial advisor, and were now facing foreclosure on the family home within 60 days unless they could secure $420,000 to pay off the accelerated loan balance. The house where I grew up, where holiday memories lived in every corner, where my grandmother had spent her final years, it was all about to disappear because of decisions I hadn't been consulted about, investments I hadn't approved, risks I would never have taken. But none of that mattered in the moment because family doesn't abandon family, right? That's what I told myself as my father's voice cracked and my mother sobbed in the background, as the weight of their crisis transferred itself onto my shoulders like it had always been destined to land there. Before I tell you what happened next, make sure you're subscribed, because this gets absolutely wild. And hit that like button if you've ever felt like your family's emergency plan. I spent that entire night running numbers, calling my financial advisor, calculating how much I could liquidate from my retirement accounts without destroying my future, how much I could borrow against my own home, how I could possibly structure a solution that wouldn't obliterate everything I'd built over 15 years of careful saving and strategic investing. Madison wasn't mentioned in that initial conversation, not as a potential contributor, not as someone who should be informed, not even as someone who would be affected by losing the family home. It was simply assumed that I would handle this, that my financial stability existed specifically for moments like these, that my carefully constructed life could be dismantled and reconstructed around their emergency without consultation or compensation. I signed papers at the bank while they promised fairness and unity, while my mother held my hand and said things like, "We'll make this right, and you're saving us, and we couldn't do this without you." Those words felt like love at the time, like recognition, like finally being seen for everything I'd always been. I didn't realize they were actually the terms of a contract I hadn't fully read. Love felt like duty, and duty slowly became a prison built from my own sense of responsibility and their strategic helplessness. The loan was structured in my name because my credit score was immaculate, my debt-to-income ratio was healthy, and I had the kind of financial profile that made banks smile and approve applications. My parents would contribute what they could once they stabilized. Madison would help out when she got back on her feet from her latest career pivot, and I would be protecting the family legacy by ensuring the house remained in the family. Except my parents' contributions were sporadic at best, a few $100s here and there when they felt guilty, always accompanied by explanations about unexpected medical bills or car repairs, or reasons why this month was particularly difficult. Madison's help never materialized because she was always between jobs, between relationships, between versions of herself that somehow never included financial responsibility or even acknowledgement of what was happening. Meanwhile, I was paying $3,800 every single month like clockwork, watching my savings evaporate, postponing my own dreams of buying a larger home or starting my own business, restructuring my entire existence around a debt that was legally mine but morally theirs. And the worst part? I did it without complaining, without demanding accountability, without even asking for recognition, because I had been trained since childhood to believe that competence means silence, that capability means sacrifice, and that love in our family was measured by how much you could endure without breaking. They came to me because I never said no, because my entire identity had been constructed around reliability, around being the daughter who solved problems instead of creating them. There's a particular psychology to being the safe child that most people don't understand unless they've lived it. You become conditioned to associate your value with your usefulness, to measure your worth by your ability to absorb chaos without complaint, to believe that love is something you earn through service rather than something you receive simply for existing. From the time I was a teenager, I had been the one my parents called when they needed rational advice, when Madison's drama had exhausted everyone, when they needed someone who wouldn't judge them or make them feel worse about their mistakes. That sounds like respect, like trust, like being valued, but what it actually was being used, because respect includes boundaries, trust includes reciprocity, and value includes compensation. What I received was access, the privilege of being needed, the honor of being indispensable, which are all just sophisticated ways of saying I was convenient. I mistook being needed for being valued, and that confusion cost me years of my life, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and nearly my entire sense of identity. When Madison called crying at 2 a.m. because another relationship had imploded, I answered and listened and offered support, and I told myself this was what sisters do. When my parents needed someone to mediate their arguments about money, to explain why their spending habits were unsustainable, to create budgets they never followed, I showed up with spreadsheets and patience, and I told myself this was what responsible daughters do. When the $420,000 loan crisis emerged, I didn't even consider saying no, not because I was generous or selfless, but because my entire sense of self was built on being the person who could handle anything, who never crumbled under pressure, who transformed problems into solutions through sheer force of competence. The psychology of being the safe child is that you become addicted to being needed because it's the only form of mattering you've ever known, and you'll sacrifice almost anything. Your money, your time, your mental health, your future, to maintain that position because losing it feels like losing your only source of value. That confusion cost me years and nearly my identity because I had structured my entire life around serving people who had learned to expect my service without offering anything substantial in return. I worked in corporate finance, a job I was good at but didn't love because it paid well, and being financially stable meant I could be the family's safety. I stayed single longer than I wanted to because relationships require emotional availability, and I was always emotionally depleted from managing everyone else's crises. I lived in a modest apartment instead of buying my dream home because I needed liquidity, needed to be ready for the next emergency, needed to keep myself small and accessible so I could continue being large and reliable for everyone else. The safe child doesn't get to have needs because having needs would disrupt the system, would force the family to rearrange itself around someone else's requirements, would reveal that the distribution of labor and sacrifice has been grotesquely unfair all along. So you keep being safe, keep being reliable, keep saying yes when you mean no, keep paying when you should be receiving, keep shrinking when you should be expanding, until one day you wake up and realize you've spent your entire life funding other people's dreams while your own gathered dust in the corner of your conscience, waiting for permission to matter, that was never going to come. She lived freely while I absorbed stress and silence, and the contrast between our lives became so stark that even strangers could see it within minutes of meeting us. Madison was 31, 3 years younger than me, and she moved through the world like someone who had never experienced a consequence she couldn't charm or cry her way out of. While I was waking up at 3 a.m. with anxiety about loan payment, calculating and recalculating my budget to figure out where I could cut expenses, she was posting Instagram stories from weekend trips to Napa Valley with her latest boyfriend, showing off brunches that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. While I was declining invitations to friends' destination weddings because I couldn't justify the expense, she was planning her third business venture that would inevitably fail within 6 months, funded by a combination of our parents' money and her seemingly infinite capacity to avoid financial reality. The difference wasn't just in our lifestyles, it was in the fundamental operating systems of our lives. I lived in a world where actions had consequences, where mistakes cost money and stress and sleepless nights. Madison lived in a world where mistakes were just stories, where financial disasters were temporary inconveniences that someone else would eventually fix. Mistakes were forgiven for her, invisibility assigned to me, and this pattern had been established so long ago that it felt like natural law rather than deliberate choice. When Madison dropped out of college her junior year to find herself in Europe for 6 months, my parents supported her decision, funded her adventure, and welcomed her home with open arms and zero expectations of repayment. When I asked for help with my student loans after graduation, loans I had taken out specifically because they told me they couldn't afford to help with college, my father gave me a speech about personal responsibility and the importance of making my own way. When Madison's second startup failed, leaving her $40,000 in debt, our parents paid it off without hesitation, framing it as an investment in her entrepreneurial spirit. When I asked them to contribute to the $420,000 loan, the loan that was saving their house, their retirement, their entire financial future, they sent $500 and a note saying they wished they could do more. The math of favoritism isn't subtle when you actually look at it. When you stop pretending that love is equally distributed just because everyone claims it. Favoritism doesn't shout. It quietly drains one person dry while filling another person's cup to overflowing. And it does so with enough plausible deniability that pointing it out makes you look petty, jealous, ungrateful. I watched Madison get chance after chance, failure after failure met with encouragement and financial rescue, while I got praised for my independence and my strength. Words that sound like compliments but actually mean, we don't have to worry about you, so we won't. I watched her make impulsive decisions without fear because she knew the safety net would catch her, while I made careful, calculated choices because I knew I was the safety net, not the person who got to use it. I watched her receive emotional support for minor disappointments, while my major sacrifices were met with casual gratitude, as if paying $3,800 monthly for 3 years was equivalent to bringing potato salad to Thanksgiving. And the most painful part wasn't even the unfairness itself. It was the way our parents had convinced themselves it wasn't unfair, the way they genuinely believed they were treating us appropriately based on our different needs, as if need was something inherent rather than something enabled, as if my lack of neediness was natural rather than carefully performed to avoid the shame of being seen as demanding or difficult. They finally said they knew I covered the loan, and for approximately 30 seconds, my heart soared with something that felt dangerously close to validation. We were sitting in their backyard on a Saturday afternoon in late spring, one of those perfect California days where the weather makes you forget that anything bad could possibly happen, and my mother had made her famous lemon cake, the one she only made for special occasions. My father had called the day before and asked if I could come over because they wanted to talk about something important, and I'd spent the entire drive imagining different scenarios, all of them involving recognition, repayment plans, maybe even an apology for how long this had taken. When I arrived, Madison's car wasn't in the driveway, which felt significant. Like maybe this conversation was specifically about acknowledging what I'd done, about finally seeing the disparity in how they'd treated us. My mother hugged me longer than usual, and my father had this look on his face, serious but warm, the expression he used when he was about to say something he'd been rehearsing. If you're watching this and realizing your family has a favorite too, make sure you're subscribed and drop a like because what I'm about to tell you is going to make your blood boil. My heart lifted for half a second when my father cleared his throat and said, "Ella, we need you to know that we're aware of everything you've done for this family, particularly with the house loan." My mother nodded, reaching across the patio table to squeeze my hand, adding, "We know you've sacrificed so much, and we want you to understand how grateful we are." The words I'd been waiting 3 years to hear were finally being spoken, and I felt this rush of emotion, relief, Validation, the sense that maybe I hadn't been invisible after all, that maybe they had been keeping track, that maybe fairness was about to enter our family equation for the first time in my adult life. I opened my mouth to say something gracious, something that would make this moment easy for all of us, something that would maintain the peace while also establishing that things needed to change going forward. But before I could speak, my father continued, and the second half of his sentence detonated everything the first half had built. That's when they delivered the real blow. Not with malice, not with cruelty, but with the kind of casual brutality that comes from people who genuinely don't understand what they're doing, who have convinced themselves that acknowledging a problem is the same as solving it. "We've decided to put the house in Madison's name," my mother said, still holding my hand, still looking at me with those grateful eyes, as if the statement made perfect sense as a follow-up to their appreciation. "We know you're financially stable and you have your own place, but Madison needs more security right now, and we think having the house will give her that foundation she's been lacking." My father jumped in quickly, reading the confusion on my face, explaining that this was actually good news, that I was released from the responsibility of worrying about the property, that they'd still find ways to compensate me over time, that this arrangement was best for everyone involved. I sat there, my hand still in my mother's grip, the taste of lemon cake turning to ash in my mouth, and I realized that acknowledgement without action isn't gratitude. It's just a more sophisticated form of dismissal, a way to make you feel seen right before they make you disappear. They said it like it was logical, even loving, like they had spent weeks analyzing the situation from every angle and arrived at this conclusion through pure reason rather than decades of conditioning that taught them Madison's comfort mattered more than my equity. My father had his business voice on, the one he used when he wanted to sound authoritative and final, when he was presenting a decision rather than opening a discussion, and he walked me through their reasoning as if I were a client receiving a financial proposal instead of a daughter learning she'd just been erased from her own sacrifice. "Madison has struggled more than you have," he explained, leaning back in his chair with his hands folded across his chest, the posture of someone who believes he's being perfectly fair. "She needs stability, and you've always been stable. You have a career, your own apartment, your life together. She doesn't have those things, and this house could be the foundation she builds from. You understand that, don't you?" The question wasn't really a question. It was a test, a way of checking whether I was still the understanding daughter, the reasonable one, the person who could be counted on to prioritize everyone else's needs above her own sense of justice. As if money had no memory or fingerprint, as if the $136,800 I had paid over 36 months had simply evaporated into some collective family fund rather than coming directly from my bank account, from my retirement contribution, from the future I was systematically dismantling to save their present. My mother added her perspective, her voice softer but no less absolute. "We're not saying you won't be compensated, sweetheart. We'll figure something out over time. But right now, legally, it makes sense to have the house in one person's name, and since Madison will probably live here after we're gone, it just seems like the natural choice." Natural. That word hung in the air like smoke, obscuring everything it touched. What was natural about rewarding the child who contributed nothing? What was natural about punishing competence and subsidizing irresponsibility? What was natural about a system where my functionality made me forgettable, and Madison's dysfunction made her precious? But these questions stayed trapped in my throat, because asking them would have made me the difficult one, the ungrateful one, the daughter who couldn't see past her own selfishness to understand the bigger family picture. That was the moment I stopped pretending this was family, not because they were putting the house in Madison's name, but because of how they did it, with gratitude and logic and the absolute certainty that I would absorb this decision the way I'd absorbed everything else. There was no negotiation, no acknowledgement that maybe I should have been consulted before they made a decision about property I had literally purchased with my own money. No recognition that fairness might involve actually compensating me rather than promising vague future repayment that we all knew would never materialize. My father kept talking, explaining how this would actually benefit me by freeing me up to focus on my own investments, how I should feel good about giving Madison this opportunity, how families support each other in different ways, and this was just one form of that support. But I wasn't listening anymore. Not to his words anyway. I was listening to the subtext, to what they were actually communicating beneath the language of logic and love. They were telling me that my role in this family was to fund, not to inherit, to give, not to receive, to sacrifice, not to benefit. And most devastatingly, they were telling me that they believed this was not only acceptable but admirable, that they saw my willingness to be used as evidence of my character rather than evidence of their exploitation. This wasn't forgetfulness or confusion, and the clarity of that realization hit me like cold water, washing away years of excuses I'd made on their behalf. Sitting in that backyard, watching my parents explain their decision with the kind of calm confidence that comes from never questioning your own righteousness, I suddenly understood that everything that had happened wasn't a series of unfortunate misunderstandings or temporary oversights that would eventually be corrected. This was the system working exactly as designed, a family structure built on the premise that some people exist to serve and some people exist to be served, and those roles are assigned early and enforced consistently through a combination of praise, expectation, and strategic helplessness. My parents hadn't forgotten to put my name on the deed. They had never intended to put it there in the first place. They hadn't overlooked my contribution. They had categorized them as obligations rather than investment. They hadn't failed to see the unfairness. They had simply decided it wasn't unfair because fair, in their minds, meant meeting Madison's needs and trusting me to meet my own. It was a system that worked perfectly for them, where one daughter could be relied upon to stabilize every crisis, while the other daughter created them without consequence, where responsibility was weaponized against the responsible, and irresponsibility was rewarded with protection and provision. I thought back through decades of moments I'd rationalized or ignored. The birthday where Madison got a car and I got a card with a check for $100. The college graduation where my achievement was celebrated with dinner at Olive Garden, while Madison's eventual graduation 5 years later was marked with a trip to Hawaii. The countless times I'd heard, "We don't have to worry about you," spoken like a compliment when it was actually an erasure. Every time I'd succeeded without their help, I'd reinforced their belief that I didn't need their help, which meant they could redirect all their resources to Madison, who had learned that failure was just another way to receive attention and assistance. The system worked perfectly because it was self-reinforcing. My competence justified their neglect. Their neglect forced me to be more competent. My increased competence justified their increased neglect, in an endless loop that left me exhausted and Madison entitled. I was the foundation, never meant to be seen, never meant to rise above ground level, just meant to hold everything up from below while other people built their lives on top of my sacrifice. Foundations don't get windows or sunlight. They get weight and pressure, and the expectation that they'll hold steady no matter how much gets piled on top. My parents had built their retirement security on my foundation, had preserved their lifestyle on my foundation, had enabled Madison's perpetual adolescence on my foundation, and now they were giving her the deed to the structure I'd held up from below, as if ownership and effort had no relationship to each other. The realization wasn't angry at first. It was just clear, like putting on glasses after years of squinting, and suddenly seeing that the blur wasn't in your vision, but in the reality you'd been trying to make sense of. They didn't see me as their daughter in the same way they saw Madison as their daughter. They saw me as their solution, their insurance policy, the person who existed to solve problems rather than have needs. And the most painful part was recognizing that this wasn't something they did consciously or maliciously. It was just how they'd organized their world, with Madison at the center requiring protection and me at the periphery providing it. And they genuinely believed this arrangement was not only natural, but good for everyone involved. I cried alone, not for the money, but for the lie, for the version of family I had constructed in my head that had never actually existed outside my desperate need to believe I was loved as much as I was used. I made it through the rest of that backyard conversation somehow, my body on autopilot, nodding at appropriate moments, asking questions that sounded reasonable, maintaining the performance of the understanding daughter, even as everything inside me was collapsing. I told them I needed time to process, which they interpreted as eventual acceptance rather than what it actually was. Shock so profound that I couldn't access language for what I was feeling. I drove home in complete silence, not even turning on the radio, just gripping the steering wheel and watching the familiar streets blur past while my mind replayed decades of memories through this new lens of understanding. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the door. And the moment I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, something fundamental broke open inside my chest and I collapsed onto the floor, sobbing in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child. Before I continue with what happened next, make sure you're subscribed because this story gets even more intense. And drop a like if you've ever felt taken for granted by the people who are supposed to love you most. I grieved the version of family I thought I had, the one where sacrifice was seen and appreciated, where fairness was a goal, even if imperfectly achieved, where both daughters mattered equally, even if they contributed differently. I mourned the parents I'd imagined, the ones who were keeping a mental tally of everything I'd done and would eventually make it right, who saw my silence as strength rather than opportunity, who valued me beyond my functionality. That grief was so physical I could barely breathe through it. My body curled on the kitchen floor while my cat, Oliver, pressed against me with that uncanny animal sense that something was catastrophically wrong. I cried for the $136,800 I would never see again. Yes, but more than that, I cried for the years I'd spent believing that love and duty were the same thing, that being needed was equivalent to being cherished, that if I just kept proving my worth through service, eventually I would receive the kind of unconditional love that Madison seemed to receive simply for existing. Some losses hurt because they reveal the truth, not just about what happened, but about what was always happening, what you'd been too hopeful or too conditioned or too terrified to see clearly. I stayed on that floor for over an hour, crying until my body had nothing left, until the grief transformed into something harder and clearer, something that felt less like sadness and more like rage mixed with clarity. I thought about every time I'd answered their crisis calls, every time I'd rearranged my life around their emergencies, every time I'd said yes when I wanted to scream no, and I realized that I had been complicit in my own erasure, not because I was weak or stupid, but because I had been trained since childhood to associate my value with my usefulness, to measure my worthiness by my capacity to absorb other people's chaos without complaint. The family system hadn't just happened to me, I had participated in building it, one accommodating decision at a time, one boundary I didn't set, one moment of self-sacrifice that taught them they could ask for more. And while that realization didn't excuse what they'd done, it gave me something crucial. It gave me the understanding that if I had participated in building the system, I also had the power to step back and let them feel the full weight of what they'd been asking me to carry alone. Every instinct told me to stay quiet, to swallow this latest injustice the way I'd swallowed countless others, to maintain family peace even if it meant sacrificing my own sense of justice and self-worth. The obedient daughter voice in my head, the one that had been trained into me through years of praise for being easy and understanding, kept offering rationalization. Maybe they would compensate me eventually. Maybe this was temporary. Maybe I was being selfish for caring about money when family should be about more than financial transaction. That voice sounded exactly like my mother's, which makes sense because it was my mother's voice, internalized so deeply that I couldn't distinguish between her values and my own. It told me that good daughters don't make waves, that strong women don't need recognition, that truly generous people give without expecting anything in return. It reminded me of every time I'd been praised for being low maintenance, for not causing drama like Madison, for being the one they could count on to handle things maturely. And mature, in our family's vocabulary, meant silent acceptance of whatever they decided, meant prioritizing collective harmony over individual fairness. But silence suddenly felt more expensive than more costly than the discomfort of finally speaking truth to people who had been protected from truth by my perpetual accommodation. For the first time in my life, I started calculating the real price of, not in dollars, though those were significant, but in self-respect, in dignity, in the fundamental question of whether I could live with myself if I continued funding a system designed to exploit me. I spent days in this internal war, pacing my apartment at 2 a.m., writing lists of pros and cons, imagining different scenarios and their consequences. The obedient daughter voice argued that confronting them would destroy the family, that I would become the villain in their story, that Madison would never understand, and my parents would feel hurt and betrayed by my sudden ingratitude. But another voice, quieter at first but growing stronger, kept asking different questions. What family was I actually protecting? What was I preserving by staying silent? If speaking the truth destroys the relationship, was the relationship ever real? Or was it just a useful fiction that served everyone but me? I chose discomfort over disappearance, and that choice felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating, like stepping off a cliff and discovering you could fly, or at least that falling was better than standing forever on the edge pretending the ground beneath you was solid. I realized that the family harmony I'd been protecting wasn't actually harmony. It was just the sound of my silence filling the space where honest conversation should have been. Real harmony requires multiple voices, requires discord and resolution, requires everyone's needs to be spoken and negotiated, rather than one person's needs being perpetually subordinated to everyone else's comfort. I thought about what I would tell a friend in this situation, what I would say to any woman who described this dynamic to me, and the advice was immediate and clear. You deserve better. This is exploitation, not love. You need to protect yourself because they clearly won't. And if I would give that advice to someone else, how could I not follow it myself? How could I demand less for myself than I would demand for any stranger? I stopped payments, explanations, emotional labor, all of it, cold turkey. like cutting off blood supply to a relationship that had been feeding off me for decades without offering nutrition in return. The decision happened on a Wednesday morning, exactly 1 week after the backyard conversation, after 7 days of that internal war, after countless hours of rehearsing what I would say and how I would say it. I woke up at 5 a.m. with absolute clarity, the kind that comes when you've exhausted every other option and finally accept that the uncomfortable path is the only honest one. I opened my banking app, canceled the automatic $3,800 monthly transfer that had been draining my account for 36 consecutive months, and felt my heart rate spike with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Then I drafted an email, not a text, because this needed to be documented, needed to be considered rather than reactive, explaining that I would no longer be making payments on the loan, that if they wanted to keep the house, they would need to find alternative finance, and that I expected to be reimbursed for the $136,800 I had already paid before any further family financial discussions could happen. I let them feel the weight I had carried alone, and the response came faster than I expected. My father called within 2 hours, his voice tight with confusion and something that sounded almost like fear. "Ella, what's going on? We got your email and we don't understand. Is everything okay? Are you having financial problems?" The questions came rapid fire, and I noticed immediately that his first assumption was that something must be wrong with me, that my decision couldn't possibly be a rational response to their actions, but must instead be evidence of some crisis on my end. I took a breath and said, as calmly as I could manage, "I'm fine financially, Dad, but I'm not fine with paying for a house that you're putting in Madison's name. I'm not fine with being treated like a bank instead of a daughter. And I'm not fine pretending this is normal or acceptable." The silence on the other end lasted so long, I thought the call had dropped, and when he finally spoke again, his tone had shifted from concern to defensive. "We explained our reasoning to you. We thought you understood. This feels very sudden and, frankly, very selfish." Freedom began the moment I withdrew support, not because I was punishing them, though they would certainly interpret it that way, but because I was finally acknowledging that my responsibility to myself had to supersede my responsibility to their comfort. That phone call was the first of many, each one following a similar pattern. My father would oscillate between hurt feelings and logical arguments about family obligation. My mother would cry and say she didn't understand why I was doing this to them. And Madison, when she finally got involved, would accuse me of being jealous and vindictive, of trying to ruin her chance at stability out of spite. None of them could or would see the situation from my perspective, couldn't comprehend that I wasn't attacking them but simply refusing to continue funding my own erasure. I stopped explaining after the third conversation because explanation requires a willing audience, and they weren't interested in understanding. They were interested in restoring the system that had worked so well for them. I stopped justifying my decision, stopped defending my boundaries, stopped engaging with their attempts to guilt me back into compliance. I simply repeated, in various forms, the same message. I will not pay for property I don't own. I expect reimbursement for what I've already paid. And until that happens, we don't have anything else to discuss about family finance. Their tone changed faster than I expected, and the transformation revealed everything I needed to know about what our relationship had actually been built on. Not love, not mutual care, but my willingness to serve and their willingness to take. Within 2 weeks of stopping the payments, the concerned parent routine dissolved completely, replaced by something harder and uglier that had probably been there all along, just hidden beneath the performance of gratitude and family unity. My father sent emails with subject lines like disappointed and expected better, messages that outlined all the ways I was failing my family obligation, how I was being remarkably short-sighted about family legacy, how my sudden change of heart was forcing them into an impossible financial position. My mother's approach was more emotional. Long text messages at odd hours about how much they'd sacrificed for me over the years, reminders of things they'd paid for decades ago. My braces, my high school class trip to Washington, D.C., as if parenting expenses from my childhood created unlimited debt that I was now repaying through the house loan. Love turned into pressure, guilt, then anger. A predictable progression that happens when people who've been taking from you without acknowledgement suddenly can't take anymore and have to confront their own behavior. Madison's involvement was particularly revealing because she'd been mostly silent during the initial crisis, happy to accept the benefit without acknowledging the cost. But now she was vocal and vicious in a way that showed her true character. She called me one evening, and I made the mistake of answering, and she launched immediately into an attack. "You're really going to let Mom and Dad lose the house because you're bitter about me getting it? You've always been jealous of me, and now you're using money to punish everyone. This is so typical of you. You do something nice and then hold it over everyone's heads forever. You're not the martyr you think you are, Ella. You're just petty and controlling, and you can't stand that for once. Something isn't about you. The words came so fast and with such conviction that I almost didn't recognize them as projection, as Madison describing herself while pointing at me. That reaction confirmed everything I feared, and everything I needed to know about what our family relationships had actually been worth. Because here's the thing about boundaries. They don't create bad behavior. They expose it. My boundary, refusing to pay for property I wouldn't own, didn't make my family manipulative, guilt-tripping, or selfish. It simply revealed that they had been those things all along, and my compliance had allowed them to pretend otherwise. When I was absorbing their dysfunction silently, I was the perfect daughter, the strong one, the reliable one. The moment I stopped absorbing it, I became selfish, cruel, jealous, vindictive. Every negative characterization they could think of, because people who benefit from your self-sacrifice will do anything to avoid examining their own role in exploiting it. My father threatened to cut me off from the family as if I hadn't already been cut off from fair treatment my entire life. My mother said I was breaking her heart, as if my heart hadn't been broken repeatedly by their casual dismissal of everything I'd done. And Madison, predictably, made herself the victim, telling relatives and family friends that I was holding the house hostage and trying to make everyone suffer, conveniently omitting the part where she'd contributed exactly $0, while I'd paid $136,800. I redirected my money, energy, and future toward building something that actually belonged to me. And that shift felt like waking up from a decades-long dream where I'd been walking through someone else's life. The $3,800 that had been disappearing into the loan every month suddenly became available again, tangible. Mine to allocate according to my own priorities rather than their emergence. The first month after stopping the payments, I just let the money sit in my checking account, staring at the balance like it was a foreign language I was learning to read. This is what having resources feels like. This is what not being drained feels like. This is what choosing myself feels like. Then I started making deliberate decisions. I maxed out my 401k contributions for the year, something I hadn't been able to do since the loan started. I opened a high-yield savings account and set up automatic transfers, watching my emergency fund rebuild itself week by week. I scheduled the dental work I'd been postponing, bought the new laptop my job required instead of limping along with my dying old one, and booked a weekend trip to Portland just because I wanted to, not because it was someone's birthday or wedding or crisis that required my presence. Not to punish, but to protect myself, to create the life I deserved, rather than the life I'd been assigned by a family system that valued my function over my fulfillment. I started therapy, something I'd always thought I should do, but never had time or money for. And my therapist helped me understand that setting boundaries isn't cruel. It's just honest. It's just saying out loud what's actually true instead of pretending that unfair treatment is love. She asked me one session, what would happen if you treated yourself the way you've been treating your family? If you showed yourself the same loyalty, the same financial support, the same automatic forgiveness? And I realized I'd been kinder, more generous, more patient with people who exploited me than I'd ever been with myself. So I started practicing self-compassion like it was a foreign language, started asking myself what I needed instead of what everyone else needed, started prioritizing my own peace over their approval. I stopped responding to guilt-trip texts immediately, letting them sit for days, or sometimes not responding at all, reclaiming my time and emotional energy from people who had been renting space in my head without pay. Walking away wasn't revenge, it was recovery. It was emergency surgery on a relationship dynamic that had been slowly killing my sense of self for 34 years. I want to be clear about this because the narrative my family tried to create, and the narrative I sometimes feared was true, was that I was being vengeful, punitive, petty. But revenge requires trying to harm someone. Recovery requires trying to heal yourself. Revenge is active aggression. Boundaries are protective defense. I wasn't trying to make them suffer. I was trying to stop suffering myself. And if my refusal to continue absorbing their dysfunction caused them discomfort, that discomfort was just the natural consequence of losing access to someone they'd been using. I didn't badmouth them to relatives, didn't try to turn family against them, didn't create drama or seek vindication. I simply stepped back, created distance, and invested in my own life with the same dedication I'd once invested in theirs. Some people called that cold. I called it survival. Some people said I was throwing away my family. I said I was finding myself. And honestly, the peace that came from not being constantly drained, not being perpetually disappointed, not waiting for recognition that would never come. That peace was worth more than any relationship built on my silence and their taking. Being useful is not the same as being loved. And that might be the most important lesson I learned from this entire devastating experience. A lesson that cost me $136,800 and nearly my entire sense of self, but ultimately gave me back something more valuable than money. For decades, I had confused my function with my value, had believed that my family's dependence on me was evidence of my importance to them, had mistaken being needed for being cherished. But need isn't love, need is just hunger. And hungry people will consume whatever's available without necessarily valuing the source. My family needed my money, my stability, my willingness to absorb chaos, my silence about unfairness, but they didn't love those things about me. They just benefited from them. Real love celebrates your growth, not just your giving. Real love wants you whole, not just useful. Real love includes reciprocity, fairness,